it's opening up new opportunities for Russia to push the boundaries elsewhere, to weaken us from within. It's tried to disintegrate both the European Union and the Atlantic Alliance, both from within and from without. It's tried to disorient and demotivate the European and American political elite. It's tried to devalue the current international order. Russia has been doing a lot of different things wherever it seeks or seizes opportunity in order to kind of get inside our political and economic systems and then to exploit us for its own agenda. Now, the kleptocratic regime in the Kremlin has a number of different interests. These are often related to energy and making money, and Russia has been pursuing these interests very aggressively against our country. So, you can go all the way back to the Salisbury poisonings a few years ago. There have been countless other cases. Only today it was announced that it seems increasingly likely that Russia unleashed a number of drones over RAF air stations back in November 2024. We've had the cases where the Prime Minister's former car was set fire to, and that's been linked back to Russia. And there are countless other cases where Russia has sought to penetrate and get inside the democratic and political systems of various European countries, from those in Central and Eastern Europe to those in Western Europe, including Germany. And this is something that's not necessarily new. I think what is new is the extent to which Russia is now pursuing this as a second front in its war against Ukraine, and the risk therein that if Russia succeeds in some way in Ukraine, and victory for Russia could take a number of different forms, it will then switch its focus towards European countries in order to get inside our areas where we are weaker, or where we have allowed ourselves to be too exposed and where we lack resilience, and it will then exploit those issues to its own accord.
Why is this Russian pivot happening now, and what does it signal about the Kremlin's long-term geopolitical strategy?
So I think there are a number of issues here. So firstly, Russia has obviously so far largely failed in relation to Ukraine. Russia thought a few years ago that it would just sort of sweep into Ukraine and there would be a rapid victory. The government of Ukraine would fall, and and it would then be in charge of the country. But that hasn't happened, largely because of the response of countries such as the UK, the US, and then Germany in helping to shore up Ukraine. So failure in Ukraine, or at least failure to this date, it's opening up new opportunities for Russia to push the boundaries elsewhere, to weaken us from within. So perhaps we will not provide Ukraine with that kind of assistance because we'll be so divided as a consequence of Russia's, its actions. So there's that possibility. Then there's also the issue that technology has developed somewhat, and I think this is something that the report's authors that you alluded to earlier have raised, and that is with AI technology. Some of the things that Russia was doing previously that would have been quite labor intensive can now be done much more rapidly using AI and AI agents that can generate the prose, can get inside the social media systems, can generate images and fabricate narratives that are both fictitious but also often have a kernel of truth that is then exploited within our political systems, which are then fans on using the new technology, social media. Of course, the internet has been with us some years, but this has also amplified the effect. And now with the latest generation of AI. So there's the sort of the need, the technological enablers. And then I think because Russia has become increasingly better at this, and then simultaneously we have within a number of Western or European countries a number of social issues, economic issues and divisions which Russia can then get inside and then exploit. So it doesn't necessarily need to create a new problem. It can often leverage an existing problem within one of our societies and then exploit that to its own agenda by fabricating, exacerbating, widening the issues at hand, and then adding its own spin to them to its own advantage.
What specific lessons do you think Russia has learned in the Ukrainian information theatre that it's now deploying globally?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think it's learned quite a lot, but having said all of that, I think much of what it has done in Ukraine, and it has done subsequently in Western or European countries, it had already started to do. So if you go back a few years, it had already realized that there was a sort of strategy or a playbook that you could utilize. For example, for many years in relation to Ukraine, but also a number of surrounding countries in what Russia describes as its somewhat arrogantly as its near abroad. It's tried to do these things already. So, for example, it has long tried to deny the sovereignty and autonomy of the countries surrounding itself. It sees itself as having a special privileged role in relation to Central and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and even Central Asia. It then has sought for many years to detach Europe from, or this area, the Central and Eastern European area from the West. It's tried to discredit neighboring governments, and particularly Western elites and their democratization efforts, as well as their collective defense assurances. It's tried to disconnect the United States, Britain, and Canada from other European countries. It's tried to disintegrate both the European Union and the Atlantic Alliance, both from within and from without. It's tried to disorient and demotivate the European and American political elite. It's tried to devalue the current international order and the values which underpin it. And it's often tried to deny its own involvement, and it's tried to deflect its involvement from the very things that it has been doing in our countries in order to deflect the blame elsewhere. So there's a playbook that it is used, and it's using it increasingly in Ukraine, and it's been using it because of the new technologies, because of the existing fissures within our economic and political systems, and it's all come together for strategic effect.
One of the tactics that the report mentions is cyber attacks and hacking. How drastically does AI lower the barrier of entry for these types of operations?
It's very difficult. I mean, this is the problem. We are, I mean, our countries, Western European, the United States, Canada, Japan, Australia, others, the kind of countries that Russia has targeted. We are open societies. We are democratic. We try to have an open information space where citizens, both within our countries and between them, can interact and engage with one another. And we wouldn't want to jeopardize that. And there's quite a strong debate going on at the moment about the extent to which we should close off social media, or we should allow certain segments, whether children or others within our societies, access to that technology. And there's a very open question about that. But at the same time, we don't want to close down our societies so that this information exchange, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, is no longer possible because of what Russia is doing. And it's not just Russia. There's also evidence that other countries such as Iran and China have been doing this as well. They can easily get inside our information space and try and corrupt it from within. But I think there is, there are ways that we can push back. Firstly, we can make ourselves more resilient. So, for example, we can force social media companies to ensure that checks and validations have taken place, so that users have photos. They're not able to be anonymous, and some social media platforms allow lots of anonymous accounts to pop up. Often they are bots, or they may be controlled by Russian agents or agencies, and they're designed to get inside our social media space and corrupt it from within. So there are things that we can do to shut this down and make it more difficult. But on the other hand, I think we need to become a bit more proactive. We've been very passive while Russia has been doing this over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think it's time that our governments, the UK government, the US government, and others elsewhere, created a coordinated response to this. Why do we allow Russia to, come after us? Why are we not being more proactive in going after Russia? And during the Cold War, for example, with the Soviet Union many decades ago, we had agencies within our countries that were designed to promote forms of propaganda, both within Russia or within the Soviet system. So why aren't we doing this much more proactively today, so that Russia is then forced into a defensive posture itself, and the regime in the Kremlin has to, deal with the concerns of its own people that we've, fanned and assisted. And I think that's another area we can push back on. So there's the issue of making ourselves more resilient by closing down the crevices or shutting out the crevices, the nooks and crannies that Russia can get into and exploit, but also creating systems that we can push back against Russia within Russia, to create, divisions within Russia itself. And everyone knows that there are many Russians that would like a very different system than the one that Mr. Putin has installed over the last sort of 20 years. There are many Russians that would like to be free like we are. So why are we not doing more to get inside their system and help them? I think that's something that we can do very relatively easily, actually.
How should international bodies, like NATO, respond to this kind of tactic?
Well, we've been moving in this area as well for some time, but again, it seems that we're not doing it so aggressively or as assertively as we might. So, over the last 10 years, we've come to terms with the fact that we're not at peace anymore. We're not at peace with a country like Russia, because Russia seeks to fundamentally break down and disorient the entire kind of Euro-Atlantic security order, not only the structures of NATO, the European Union, and the position that both Britain and the United States have held in that order as its ultimate national custodians, but at the same time, the very democratic systems, the liberal systems, the open societies that we've created. So, it's been very actively doing this. Now, the question is, how does it gain access to the new technologies, and then how can it exploit those? So it comes back to the issues that we've just been talking about. So long as we make ourselves more resilient, so long as we close down the opportunities that Russia has to get inside our open systems and to exploit them from within, it will become much more harder. But at the same time, we need to be aware that the nature of the international, or the nature of the competition that we have with Russia is not friendly, and we need to kind of bed into that assumption and then respond accordingly. So our politicians, I think, and our political leaders need to accept that we're just involved in a long-term competition with Russia, and that's just not going to end anytime soon. So rather than hoping that we can overcome this and revert to a better time, it's about creating the institutions of state, the national forms of resilience, and the institutions to push back, and to really prioritize that in a way I think that we haven't. And the consequences that we're now seeing of this, that we've just been talking about, they'll just continue unless we get to really get on top of it. During the Cold War, we had, with the Soviet Union, we had institutions set up to do some of the things that we've just been discussing. There was an organization within the Foreign Office called the Information Research Department that was founded in 1948. It was closed in the late 1970s. But it did a lot of work in terms of black and white propaganda to frustrate the Soviet Union, to frustrate communism wherever it was being articulated. And it was relatively successful. Now, of course, you might not be able to create such a clandestine organization in today's society, but I do think there is a need for something like it, updated to modern context with modern technology, that would be able to organize that international response and to create a spearhead for our own national response in both making ourselves more resistant to Russia and also exploiting the fissures and problems within Russia, so that the Russian government in the Kremlin is distracted.
The report highlights how operators exploit domestic ideology and political tensions within society. How could Russia look to do this?
Yeah, so I think that's also another thing that's been building up. I think we have to be very frank and say that most North American countries have suffered a number of problems over the last 20 years, probably resulting from two things. Firstly, deindustrialization that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, that kind of created fundamental changes within the socioeconomic makeup of our societies. There are areas of Britain, there are areas of America, and now increasingly, Germany, France, other countries that are, left behind, or they're not prospering as much as the sort of central nubs of new technology are. And those people are obviously rather unhappy with the status quo, and they wish to seek change. So, if we make our societies better, then, those people will not feel so disenfranchised. Russia will not have, groups of people that it can potentially convince and exploit. So we have our homework to do here to level up or to improve those regions, so that they do not feel disenfranchised, so they're not ready for countries such as Russia to exploit. We also need to think about our own politics, because when we have a fragmented political system, and of course, again, we are open societies, we are democracies, so there are going to be differences of opinion. But when our politicians are potentially willing to run with Russian narratives or even to be influenced by them and to use those for domestic political effect, that is to say, to achieve a kind of a one-upmanship over their own nationals, their own citizens, even though they may be of a different political persuasion, I think that also benefits Russia. It just continues to create and sow division that kind of deactivates us. And while we're squabbling among ourselves, it means that we have less attention to pay to things that Russia might be doing without us from outside of our society, for example, in Ukraine or in Georgia or the Caucasus or in Moldova or in countless other countries that are surrounding it, or even beyond that in countries like countries in North Africa where Russia has also been very active, often embracing a very similar playbook. So, I think it's about, again, just making ourselves more resilient and then creating systems that we can push back against Russia to the extent that it just cannot get inside our political system so effectively than it has over the last 10 to 15 years. And we can still have open democratic societies in the same way that we did during the Cold War when we were confronted by the Soviet Union. We can do the two things simultaneously. It just requires us to have a cleverer way of engaging, and also understanding, again, as I said earlier, that we are in this long-term period of competition.
Russian state bodies are increasingly outsourcing campaign execution to private contractors and proxies. How can this be defended against when these actors are in most cases extremely hard to identify and to track?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. The spread of the internet and the spread of globalization allows now lots of different potential uh, entities to be employed to do this, and they can be connected together today in a way that they couldn't perhaps 10 or 15, let alone 20 years ago. So even though Russia has been it's had a common playbook for some time, the new technologies, the leveling of economies through globalization allows it to draw together a broader and broader group of actors in order to pursue this. And because they can be founded very quickly or co-opted very quickly, and then often disbanded if they become ineffective, or if they become, if they are found out, or if the area of focus simply switches, then Russia is able to do this. As I said, it's very, very difficult to combat. We can take measures within to harden, to make our systems more resilient, and you've been trying to do that but it's taken a very long time for our politicians and the sort of political and economic class to become aware of this, or at least to take action to overcome it, or even to accept that it's happening. Because I think often it's happening in areas where they may not themselves be familiar. It's happening within social media space, among young people, among generations that that they are not part of. So it's about identifying this and then swiftly, I would say, very swiftly, implementing responses to it, which of course do not harm our democratic system and our openness, but just freeze Russia out. And simultaneously, to come back to what I said earlier, we've got to go on the offensive, because if we become extremely reactive, then all we are doing is reacting each time to Russia's kind of thrusts and attacks, and it prevents us from forcing them onto the back foot ourselves. So however we do that, it may not be symmetrical in the sense of we need to do the same things that they are doing, but it might be that, for example, we support a country which they are very hostile to. In this case, for example, Ukraine. The more we do there to assist Ukraine, the more of their attention will be pulled into that conflict, and therefore the less will be available. The less of their attention will be available to attack us using these very means that we've just been discussing.
Is it more important now than ever that the West is united in its sharing of information?
I think the United Kingdom, our country, it has gone in some ways the furthest here. Although if you go back 5 or 6 years, it was very, Britain has been quite aware that Russia is a deep, pervasive and immediate threat to our interests, to our way of life. I think some of our European allies were very, very slow to realize this for a number of different reasons, often relating to their dependency on Russian energy. And they really had, or they felt that they had no alternative to this degree of dependency because it was relatively cheap, and it, a plentiful supply. There were vested interests involved in their own societies, and nobody really wanted to pay any attention to this. But I think since the Russian invasion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, almost everybody has woken up to this. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here to coordinate between our European allies, and Britain has been very, I think, even aggressive in doing this, very proactive over the last 5 years or so, and that's gone beyond specific prime ministers or particular governments of both left and right. And that's something that we need to continue. It needs to have a cheerleader almost. And Russia sees the UK, I think, now as its primary opponent, its primary enemy in the world. And in some ways, that should be a badge of honor, because it shows that they know that we are both aware of what they're doing, but we're also prepared to push back. So we need to identify exactly how their specific attacks, and we identified some of those earlier, not only in the UK, but also in countries overseas, are part of a broader strategy, which is often very opportunistic. I think sometimes the Russians are given too much credit for their strategic agenda. Yes, they do have one. They wish to degrade the prevailing international order. They wish to degrade democracy. They wish to degrade the liberal societies around them, because they're terrified of what might happen if those forms of governance emerge in Russia, or if people start calling for them. But at the same time, we need to be aware that we need to draw our allies together to push back, and to do so in such a way that their opportunism cannot succeed. So that's the issue of making ourselves more resilient, but at the same time creating systems that we can thrust and push back at them, so that we distract them, so that they cannot turn their attention and their ire, frankly, on us.